Very Reverend Father Matthew Chirivadi, the Honorable Manager of our college, most respected Principal Dr. Joseph, distinguished and eminent keynote speaker of the day, Dr. Catherine Rosario, Head of the Department of English, Dr. Nisa Mary Tommy, dear colleagues, loving students, delegates, and participants who are present here from all over the world. Good day to all. Today, this task of introducing our guest of honor and keynote speaker, Dr. Catherine Rosario, is a great privilege for me as well. As Dr. Neeru has said in her welcome address, Dr. Catherine Rosario is an associate lecturer from the Department of Theatre and Performance, Goldsmiths, University of London. Dr. Catherine's research interests are wide-ranging, with a particular focus on meeting points between popular art forms, canonical works, and the avant-garde, as well as teaching at Goldsmiths on modernism, postmodernity, translation, and adaptation. She also directs musicals and trains actors at various colleges. Dr. Catherine's background combines literature and theatre, as she did a BA in English language and literature at the University of Southampton and a master's in creative writing in prose from the University of East Anglia, and a practice-based PhD in theatre and performance at Goldsmiths. Dr. Catherine's publications include Animals and Angels, a scene of abjection in Leicester's shop window in Regent Street, published in the journal Performance Research in 2015. Then another paper is Islamic Extremism and the Merchant of Venice, which was published in France Commentary in 2014, and many online articles on theatre, art, film, TV, and theory. Dr. Catherine's recent theatre writing includes Strange Land, a musical based on the writings of Ernst Stroller, with original lyrics by Tim Gilvin at the Chelsea Theatre, London. Then How to Make Money Art with Carolyn Byrne at the Phoenix Artists Club, sharing Strauss, and collaboratively writing and devising an adaptation of the Odyssey for Factory Theatre, London. It was directed by Tim Carroll, with toured Britain, including the Globe Theatre, London. She is currently finalizing a book on rewriting of Shakespeare's Othello, which spans 4 centuries and explores the aesthetic of burlesque and tragedy. I know that I have touched only the tip of the iceberg, and I am certain that there are many laurels and feathers already in her cap yet to be mentioned, and the best is yet to come. I'm sure that we will be enriched and enlightened by the keynote address, and with utmost respect, I wholeheartedly welcome and hand over the virtual mic to Dr. Catherine Rosario. Thank you, and over to you, Dr. Catherine Rosario.
You need to unmute your microphone.
Yes, I've just remembered. Sorry. Thank you so much for that introduction and for the invitation to speak here. It's a perfect conference for my interest. So I was delighted to be contacted by Dr. Nisu, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing the other talks at this conference. What I want to talk about, which was just briefly mentioned there, is that I'm writing a book about Othello, the Moor of Venice, Shakespeare's tragedy. And I'm looking at how, firstly, Shakespeare himself was an adapter. And so the most of my talk today actually would be just looking at all the fascinating sources that Shakespeare himself wove together in this kind of tapestry to create Othello, and how this process then meant that his play was very fertile ground for future adaptations, and what those adaptations say about the people and the cultures who've created those adaptations. Because I think that's the beauty of an adaptation. We know what the source material is, so then it's so revealing what a writer does with that source material, what they seize on, what they are not interested in the material, and the parts that they are, and why, you know, why that one part of a fellow speaks to a certain culture and the other part is of less interest. But really, I'm just giving the example of a fellow, but what I would be very interested to discuss is how the same process works with, for example, a classical Indian text or a text from anywhere else in the world. But I think it's quite helpful to just sort of see, you know, to focus in on one text and see what can be revealed when you research where all the sources have come for a play. So I'm going to share my screen. I've just got a little PowerPoint. I hope this will work. Yes, so I just put this on. Okay. Just go from. Can you all see the screen?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes. Okay. Lovely. Thank you. So this is the title. Just so you know, just for a bit of clarity, how can successive adaptations of the same classical text help us trace how we have arrived at our own present? The example of Shakespeare's Othello, the Moor of Venice. Okay. So this is a recent production of Othello. But it was first performed, the first record we have was on Hallowmas Day, which I think you might call All Saints Day. We call it All Saints Day. I think the day after Halloween, 1st of November 1604, at a banqueting house at Whitehall in London by the King's Men. And the King's Men was Shakespeare's own company. So he was also an actor, a businessman, a manager, and they had the patronage of the King James I, who was the recent king in England. And the basic story of so the question I want to look at first is, how did Shakespeare's drawing on, adapting myriad forms in creating Othello, make it such fertile territory for future adaptations? So this same thing I was saying before, you know, what is it about Othello that makes it so rich to adapt? And one thing we'll see is that in some ways there's one reason is because it questions of ethnicity and gender and class all come together in Othello, because you have a black man marrying a white wealthy woman, and then a servant, this Iago character, who tries to turn the tables on his master, on Othello, by convincing Othello that his wife has been unfaithful to him. So you can see right there, you've got various tensions between class and gender and ethnicity. So I just want to say this is the main source for the narrative of Othello, and it's from a collection of stories written by an Italian called Cinthio, and it was written not just a few decades before Shakespeare wrote Othello, but it's a collection of much earlier stories, and this is this sort of thing of a sort of like a tapestry, because the story which Shakespeare's Othello is based on is called the Capitano Moro, which is about a black captain, a Moorish captain. So from originally Islamic, but a convert to Christianity. And this story in itself, it has got an earlier echo in the story called The Three Apples from the Arabian Nights, which, as I'm sure you know, is a collection of stories from the Middle East, from India, from various places in that region, which were all collated together to make this story of the Thousand Nights, with the framing device of a young woman being able to save her life every night by telling the Sultan another story so that he wouldn't kill her, because she wants to hear another story. So her power of speech is able to kind of keep her alive, his character, Sherazad. And this is, I put this image up because we can see still these stories are being retold. Okay, so I want to look at what it is about Othello, why there are these sort of tensions within the plot. So I'm looking at the aesthetic issues in Othello, as in how it's put together. So the Hecaphomony is the narrative story, but what dramatic elements did Shakespeare draw upon to tell this story? And maybe before I go any further, just briefly, in case anyone doesn't know the story, and there's no reason you would, Othello is a much older man who's seen a lot of life. He's a military man. He's much valued by the state of Venice because he's such a good fighter and a commander. But then he marries a very wealthy white woman from Venice, and her father is very upset about this, because it's one thing to have a black man defending the state, it's another to have him actually marrying your daughter. So already there's tensions, there's the father disowning the daughter. They go off because there's a skirmish in Cyprus. So they leave Venice, and then they're sort of isolated. She's taken away from her world and she joins his military world. And in this place, Othello's servant, Iago, who's also a soldier, is able to persuade Othello that she's unfaithful. And he is so infuriated, so, in such pain and jealousy over this infidelity, which feeds into all his insecurities, that he becomes convinced it's true and murders Desdemona. So it's one of Shakespeare's tragedies. When he realizes his terrible mistake, he then kills himself. So that's the kind of basic story. So one of the sources seems to be, when I was looking at this, is the mystery play, because when Shakespeare was growing up, these plays would still have been put on in his early life. They were subsequently banned by the church because the church felt that they wanted to be more in control of narratives around the Bible. But basically these mystery plays were put on in various places around Europe by local people, local tradesmen, would take different stories from the Bible, and there would be everyone else could mill around and hear these stories. There were different floats which had got different stories on different sort of stages, and you could go from stage to stage and hear all the stories from the Bible. But there was often quite a lot of humor and laughter in these stories, and I think the church thought, it's getting out of hand, so that these were banned. But when Shakespeare was young, he would still have seen them. And of course, being a Christian college yourself, that the key battle in Christianity between forces of darkness and forces of light, between good and evil. And you can see this in Othello in a lot of the language, because Desdemona, his wife, is set up as this angel. She's often spoken of as an angel. And Othello is increasingly described as a devil as he becomes more deranged. So there's this classic binary of her goodness being extinguished by his evil by the end. And this sort of runs through well, it begins really quite early on in Othello, really, and then it kind of reaches a crescendo. However, that's not the sort of full story at all in Othello, because when the mystery plays were banned, and in fact in Britain, I don't know if you still have the same thing, in Britain we still do a little bit of mystery play, because in schools the children perform the nativity, which is basically was one of the key scenes from the mystery plays. And we have actually now revived a whole tradition of mystery plays in some parts of the country. There's a famous one in York, which is done every 4 years. But when they got banned in this period, which is a period, you know, of course, was a period of much less religious freedom in the 16th century, they were replaced by morality plays largely, because morality plays were still to happen, because they weren't actually taking scenes from the Bible. These plays were more general explorations of how we choose the right path through life. So the morality plays would invariably have an everyman figure who we could all relate to. And this everyman character would yes, have temptations on the way, and mentors who would lead him to from temptation. And so you can see in some ways this is more, whereas the mystery plays is sort of good and evil, has this kind of binary opposition to it. This is more a tripart trait, because you have the everyman figure in the center, and you have good and evil fighting for his soul. And the interesting thing with Othello is that in many ways Shakespeare has been bold enough to put this black man as everyman, as the one who represents us. Because while sometimes he's a devil for Desdemona's angel, in other ways, he is the everyman figure who could be tempted to goodness by Desdemona, or tempted to evil, servant, Iago, who then also is increasingly called the devil. So if Iago is the devil, the servant, and Desdemona is the angel, then that actually puts Othello in the everyman position as somebody who could take either path, who could not listen to the servant and cleave to what is beautiful and good in his wife. So the interesting thing there for the structure of the play is that the morality play is always redemptive at the ending. It always has a good, happy ending, in the sense that every man makes the right choice. So when I was researching this, I thought, this is interesting. In Othello, does that, even though it's a tragedy, and in tragedies everyone is going to die, aren't they? All the key figures. Something about this structure, it feels like underneath makes us keep thinking, no, he's going to make the right choice. He's not going to let this servant, this scheming servant, destroy his happiness, who she's finally found with this woman after years and years of kind of lonely battle. So we keep that hope up, but of course the overriding structure is Greek tragedy. For Shakespeare, it is a tragedy. So ultimately he makes the wrong choice. And of course, in the period that Shakespeare was writing, there was huge interest in ancient Greek tragedy, which is from some 5th century before Christ, so 2,000 years earlier. But there was a revival of interest in that period, in the Renaissance, the rebirth, and Shakespeare took this form of tragedy as did many of his contemporaries, and it's a very powerful form. It drags you along to the end. It's very focused, and you this idea that of catharsis, you know, that in watching a character do everything that they shouldn't do, you learn from that, but you also experience that kind of sense of relief as you walk away at the end. So, but there's some more. There's more in this Othello. It's even more complex, because not only we've got elements of mystery play, morality play, Greek tragedy, we also have this insistent comedy. And so in the period in which Shakespeare was writing, there was the comedy dell'arte, which were these traveling players who began in Venice, actually, which is where the play is set, this form of acting and comedy, but it's spread out throughout Italy and throughout much of the rest of Southern Europe. And these performers improvise on basic scripts. And actually, a lot of these basic scripts themselves came from ancient classical comedy, but they would improvise as they were going. And the classic characters, and these characters really pop up all over the place, are the older man, the older jealous husband, called Pantalone in Commedia dell'arte, with a beautiful young wife who's always suspicious that someone is stealing his wife. And of course, you have the wily servant who will not accept his status in life. He wants to be the master. He wants to rule the master. And he does this by isolating the master from everyone else, making the master believe that his wife is unfaithful, that this person is stealing money from him, so that the master increasingly becomes dependent on the servant, and the role reverse will switch over. So you can obviously see this in Othello. And that is part of Othello's humiliation, that he knows he's a figure of fun. He's the old man who thinks a young woman would love him. Of course, this young woman doesn't love him. This is what he convinces himself. In fact, she does love him. So all these different forms are battling together in Shakespeare's Fellow. And this then makes it, you know, as I am arguing in this book, very ripe territory for future adaptations, because you have the tragedy, but you have the comedy. And you can tilt the play as you wish in order to make one or the other stand out. So we're now hopping forward to the 19th century. So Othello was not actually particularly rewritten between the 17th century and the 19th century. It was edited to remove characters who were felt to be too vulgar in the 18th and 19th century. There's a prostitute figure called Bianca. Off she goes. There's a clown, which people felt was inappropriate in a tragedy. So they were trying to kind of tidy up Shakespeare's Othello. And these versions were used right until the 20th century. It wasn't really until then that the original Shakespeare versions were revived to a large extent. But the major change, the major rewrite in the 19th century was these burlesques of Othello. So, but before we get onto the burlesques, this is Ira Aldridge, who's an African-American actor, who was one of the first Black men to perform as Othello. There was somebody else about 20 years before him. But before that, the part had always been played by a white man in black makeup. And indeed, in Shakespeare's time, as I'm sure you may well know, there were no female actors. So Desdemona was also played by a white man, but a young, almost like a boy, a white boy would play all the female characters. They'd have these young, pretty boy actors. But anyway, Ira Aldridge became one of the very first Black men to play Othello. And in this period, what was key about this period is the 19th century was when the Atlantic slave trade was gradually banned through a series of acts in America, in Britain, in other parts of the world. So this was, and so Ira Aldridge was key to this, the campaign to destroy slavery. Him as an example of this fine Shakespearean Black actor in itself was like a poster boy for abolishing slavery, because it was saying, you know, look, this is who you're enslaving. People like me who are able to be so grand and impressive and so skilled in what they do. So Ira Aldridge was part of this campaign to end slavery, and Othello was also used as a play to show the nobility of this character, emphasizing what was noble about him rather than what was not. Meanwhile, these burlesques began, which were very short. Sorry? Were very short, comical, very rude. And just yeah, kind of did that, you know, the comic interruptions where you where the burlesque would sort of basically really seize upon the comedy element of Othello, the commedia dell'arte, which we were looking at with Othello as this ridiculous, jealous man, and the servant dynamic and everything, and indeed would have Desdemona, his wife, actually being unfaithful. So the thing that he feared actually happens in some of these burlesques. So the whole thing is just sent up and made ridiculous. And so you can see how this classical text is how the people who were nervous about the loss of slavery, nervous about what is said about them as people that they had enslaved Black men, it was like a kind of pressure valve to mock this story of Othello, to make it a ridiculous comedy. So while they're doing that, meanwhile, Ira Aldridge is insisting on the dignity of Othello. So it's a kind of a battle is going on with this text in the 19th century. And I just want to finish by looking at one example of a play from the 20th century, which is Paul Laveau's A Tale About a Handkerchief. So I was looking at sort of series of adaptations. So there were a huge number of these burlesques of Othello and also other classical texts. And then post-1960, again, Othello becomes of great interest throughout the British Empire. This is an American rewriting by marginalized groups who want to explore their identity through Othello. So there's rewritings by Black people, there's rewritings by working class people looking at everything from the perspective of Iago, looking at it as the servant. You know, maybe Iago is right to turn the tables on the master. Maybe Iago has got a point. Why should he be exploited and accept his position? And also feminist rewriters, rewriting it from the point of view of Desdemona as not just this tragic figure, but as a woman who has her own needs and desires, which is all in the original Othello as well, but swinging the action around so that rather than seeing the main stage where all the sort of the big macho stuff is happening, in this play, A Tale About a Handkerchief, what's inspiration, really very clever, is that everything is set backstage, in a sense. Everything is set in the laundry room and the kitchens where the women get on with domestic work. And this is Desdemona with her servant, Amelia, who is also the wife of a fellow servant, Iago. And she is not a passive woman anymore, but a woman who actually seizes, who wants more from life, and life is able to give a 17th century woman in Venice. So that was just really a kind of a whistle-stop tour of how Shakespeare's allows all these different interpretations to come out of it. And partly, and this is, I think, as you said, an appeal of Shakespeare's, because there's so much ambiguity in the original play. Because he was like a magpie, you know, taking influences from everywhere, constantly switching our perspective so that we pity one person and despise another, and then it swings on its axis and we see it from another person's perspective. And these two models as well, which I'm interested in, tragedy and comedy, that comedy makes us lose our empathy in some ways against the figure who we're laughing at. Well, if we laugh at somebody, we don't identify with that character anymore. And traditionally, tragedy is for the wealthy people, the central people. Their lives are tragic. Everyone else's life is just kind of comic and has no, one thing just happens after another. There is no kind of great arc. And so by placing somebody from your group, like placing a woman or placing a Black person within that tragedy, you give their life a sort of a significance and a meaning which comedy robs them of it. So all these tensions as well, but particularly between comedy and tragedy, and between evolving ideas of men, master and servant. So yes, that's it really. But I'd be very interested to open it up into exploring other texts if we have some time. I think we've got some time for questions. Well, I've certainly got lots of time. Okay, thanks so much.
Thank you, ma'am, for that enlightening and entertaining session. Now it's the Q&A session. So like participants can either raise your questions or post them in the chat box.
I'm not sure if I can see the chat box. I usually can see. I think I need to take this away, maybe to share screen. Oops.
Yeah.
Gone. Yeah, stop share. Well, I've got a question. Has how familiar are people with Othello?
Hello, ma'am.
Oh yes, sorry. Yes, I can see something here now in the chat. Can you please
read it out? Shall I read it out?
Yes, it's just the one at the bottom. Can you please explain?
Can you please explain about the comic characters from Shakespeare?
Yes. So this is the interesting thing with Shakespeare, that he, in many of his tragedies, he uses certain comic scenarios, and it's almost like that is his ability to empathize, that he looks at somebody who before would just be for fun, and he sees the pity in their situation. So if you think of another play that he wrote based in Venice, The Merchant of Venice, he has this Shylock character who in many ways, as you know, Jewish people were persecuted and would also be kind of a figure of fun. He's just like almost like a comedy villain initially. And The Merchant of Venice is not Shylock. The Merchant of Venice is Antonio, the main character. So really, Shylock is more like a small subsidiary character. But it's like Shakespeare gets so interested in what is it like to be somebody who's mocked and isolated, that Shylock begins to dominate the whole of his play. So this is a sort of another example, but with that question, is there anything specific you would like to discuss about comic characters from Shakespeare?
Hi, ma'am. I'm not asking about anything specific. If we are talking about the clowning system or talking about some kind of clowns, mostly they are representing the Shakespeare are using this kind of comic characters. Shakespeare are using this kind of clowning characters. It's not exactly clown, but they have some kind of specific things, right? So, in generally, can you please explain about the comic characters, how Shakespeare using in their drama?
Okay, yes. So this, as you say, this is a very interesting thing about Shakespeare, this figure of the clown, who in some ways has got a reality during Shakespeare's period, because the courts themselves would actually have court jesters who were clowns and who are, acrobats, physically funny, verbally funny, and would often play with language, turn language upside down, and also had the freedom, because they were in some ways also seen as mad, as fools in that sense, not entirely in control of their minds, that they were able to say things to powerful people and get away with it because they were a fool. So they were often the only way to tell a king or a queen that they were going wrong was the fool was able to say this, because anyone else said that, they would be off in the tower, but the fool was given more freedom to speak, and as a real person in the court. So Shakespeare uses them often, these fools, and there is a fool a fool or clown. There is one in Othello, but it has a very small part. And at one point, I think I was arguing that you don't need a fool in Othello, because everybody becomes a fool in Othello in some way. But it's very complex, because there's different fools. There's the stupid fools, and then there's the wise fools. And often it's the stupidity of fools, though, which makes them wise as well, because they just see the world in a way that nobody else does, and you think that's ridiculous, and then you sort of see there's a wisdom behind the stupidity. So it's this constant sort of border between them both, but between, yes, foolishness and wisdom, holiness and evil as well comes together in the fool. They both seem like they can sometimes feel like they're a cipher for God's words, and then other times they just descend into these sort of evil characters. So they disrupt the play, these characters, and particularly have a role in tragedies. So that nothing, it's not like a Greek tragedy. In fact, people used to object, contemporaries of Shakespeare would object and say, this is not proper tragedy here. This is a hybrid form. This is a bastard form, which is mixed different forms, because you've got comedy in there, and an ancient Greek tragedy would not have comedy in that way. It would be much more focused. So yeah, I hope that answers a little. It's interesting. Shakespeare advocates his notions through the clown characters. Yes, exactly. Well, yes, that's interesting, isn't it? Is that Shakespeare on the stage with his clown characters popping up all over the place? I think there's definitely an argument for that. Just looking at the next comment.
Okay, ma'am. There is another question from Dr. Takshil Haidar Nakvi. He asks, does Othello represent Muslim community? As I have read somewhere that through the character of Othello, Shakespeare targeted the Muslim community, showing that Muslims are heartless and tyrant.
Yes, so it's interesting that this is a huge area of exploration about what is meant by the Moor, even, because the Moor is an ambiguous term. It could mean a black man. It could mean a man from an Islamic country. It could, the idea of a fellow, it seems to be that he's converted to Christianity and that he was originally Islamic. So, and the whole period in which, the reason they go to Cyprus is because Venice is a Christian state, which has Cyprus as part of its domain. And the Turks, the Ottomans, the Ottoman Empire, which was powerful at that period, is attempting to take Cyprus, a Christian place. And so Othello, if he is originally is Muslim, he's in a sense, he's fighting against his own people, which perhaps alienates him even more, in that he is now working for the Christians, possibly has converted to Christianity. It's never entirely clear, I don't think, in the play. And by the time Shakespeare wrote the plays, it's actually set about 30 years earlier, because by the time Shakespeare wrote it, and it was performed in 1604, Cyprus had actually become part of the Ottoman Empire. It had been taken over. The Muslim forces had managed to grab it. So he was writing very much in a period when Islam was on the ascendance in Europe. In Britain, in these little country churches by the seaside, people used to say prayers. Please don't let the Barbary pirates take me, because there was trade in slavery with Moorish pirates coming right onto the coast of Britain and grabbing people. So it was much more of a kind of, which way was Europe going to go, Christian or Muslim? So I think the character of Tartaglia was interesting. Yeah, heartless. Well, yes and no. This is the thing, isn't it? Are the Muslims, it is a fellow heartless and a tyrant. The thing with this ambiguity with Shakespeare, that he behaves heartlessly when he realizes the enormity of what he's done. He kills himself. Does he have too much heart? It's very complex, but certainly the language, yes, the language would make us uncomfortable now. I think it does make us uncomfortable now, because it feels like this sort of racist language towards the fellow. But yeah, and the whole debate as well, is he sub-Saharan African, kind of a black man, which is often how he's been played recently, because that is, since the slave trade, that has been a more potent exploration in Europe, relationships between black people and white people, rather than Islam. But now increasingly, of course, Islam is in the debate in Europe, and this play probably could be used to explore that. The other final thing I would say is, in Shakespeare's time, Muslims were seen as being more sensuous and more sexually free than Christians. So I think Othello also represents that, a certain, which in Christianity was more. So it's slightly switched around now, because in Europe, things that people are more free sexually and everything. But at that time, Islam was regarded as the sort of the central sexual race, as opposed to Christianity.
Ma'am, shall I move on to the next question?
Yes, please.
Okay. From Kirtana Chandra. Hello, ma'am. What's your view on an author adapting a text and transforms it to a whole different text sometimes? Sometimes goes beyond even genre. Does the original lose its impact after of its adaptation?
Yeah, it's a tricky one. I mean, I suppose if you think of what Shakespeare did, you can't really. Shakespeare could hardly complain, because he did that. He would literally just find a seed of something which interested him in some other person's text, and use that and of course, the time he was writing, there was much less sort of sense of ownership of text. You know, a lot of the stories, you know, 1001 Night, these are in the oral traditions, it gets lost who first came up with these stories. They just become shared stories, and he would just dip in and take what he wanted. I think what's enjoyable about having a text which you're adapting is it gives you limitations, which makes you creative in thinking, how can I adapt that text? So you've got to think, oh, how am I gonna, what's the equivalent in my story for this? And I think that can be quite valuable. And I think you can completely depart from the story, but that's fine as well. But yeah, you're not engaging with the story in quite the same way as if you try to really closely find equivalents. So, for example, I saw an adaptation recently of Chekhov's Three Sisters set in Nigeria, and it seemed to start off, it seemed to lose the thing which has, which is the domesticity, the subtext, the conversations, the simple conversations between people when apparently not much is happening. By suddenly putting loads of action into the play, it seemed to destroy that quality of Chekhov. But, you know, maybe it created something else, something different and valuable in its own way. Yes, that's, I guess, what I would say.
Ma'am, next question from Shamsuddin TP. Othello is constantly called the Moor. We know historically about the Moorish kingdom of Spain, where Spanish Muslims and where Spanish Muslims or Moriscos were forcibly converted to Christianity in 1492. Is it a reference to Othello's spiritual and cultural identity?
Interesting. Could the person who asked the question, would they be able to just expand a bit more on what they mean about the fellows?
Shamsuddin. Shamsuddin TP, can you please explain your question or expand it a bit?
Or I mean, I could just have a little shot at it. I mean, that's interesting, that date of a forcible conversion to Christianity. So it's interesting. I mean, so Judaism is not interested in converting anyone. It's not that kind of religion. Christianity and Islam are both, as we know, religions that like to convert. They like to increase the congregation in either way. So what is really notable, I suppose, is this constant back and forth, because Spain had been Christian prior to that, then becomes part of the Moorish Empire, and there's forcible conversions of Christians to Islam, and then there's forcible conversions back again. So it never, it's a constant sort of two forces really battling out for people's souls. And when is it a reference to Fellow's spiritual and cultural identity? Well, yes, and I think for Shakespeare, this idea of the outsider, Venice was a interesting place in that it wasn't a kingdom like a lot of places in Italy. It was a republic, very unusually at that period, and it was a sort of meeting place for different cultures. That's what made it so dynamic. But there were limits, and there's sort of limits in the sense that Desdemona, part of a very wealthy white family, couldn't marry a fellow. Oh, well, certainly her father didn't want her to, even though her father's friend was a fellow. So yes, so this thing that how does a fellow position himself in this world where he's half accepted and not accepted? How does he feel about everything he has lost of his identity in order to join this world? this we know not much about, except that he gets very upset about this handkerchief which his mother gave him. And you feel almost this is part of his past. What is part of his past? A very fragile thing that maybe all he's got left of his past. And he gives this fragile little token to his wife, and she unfortunately loses it. And that becomes key to his believing she's faithful, because his servant convinces him that this handkerchief was given to someone else. And in some ways, you can see this handkerchief as representing a sort of fragile piece of his identity from who he was. And she just gives it to someone. As far as he thinks, she just throws it away like trash, gives it to someone else.
Ma'am, next is from Abhi, and he's asking on your views on Leontes and Othello. Also, he's asking, why does jealousy get a race dimension in Othello?
So, your views on Leontes and Othello?
Yeah, Leontes and
Yes.
Othello.
Yes. So Leontes isn't in Othello. You mean Leontes in Hamlet? Are you sort of comparing the two?
Just ask your views on Leontes and Othello. There is
Yeah. So he's not. Is he there, Abby? Just to clarify. No. So
Hi. Good evening. Good evening.
Hello.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
That was a great session. Thank you. I just wanted to know, why is it that the race dimension gets amplified when we read a play like Othello, whereas when we read Winter's Tale, it's jealousy that's foregrounded.
You're thinking of a Winter's Tale with Leontes. Yes. So that's and you're. Yes, that's interesting. So in
fact, the play Othello as a play has a lot of racist slurs, and there are debates as to whether the play in itself is racist, and that has impacted the characterization part of it. So I just wanted to know, how do you perceive it, the difference between the points of convergence and divergences, Leontes and Othello?
Yes, that's interesting. So in A Winter's Tale, Leontes has this sudden onset of jealousy, doesn't he? And he just believes his wife to be unfaithful with his best friend. So, and as you say, they're all white in that. So it. Well, I suppose I would say that Othello and Shakespeare, maybe his focus is on something different then, and his focus there is on time and on what time does to our memories and our ability to forgive, and different generations, how a new generation can bring hope when the old generation has destroyed hope. I would think it's more what's happening in Winter's Tale, which in some ways is a less compelling play, maybe for that reason, than Othello. So I think the reason it's so, as you say, and it's so many racist slurs, and they pile up, and this whole idea of darkness and light, and devils. Because in that period that there was this blurring between this idea of devils as satanic force and black people looking like devils. So, but I think Shakespeare was interested in that. I think, having seen these mystery plays and seen these devil-like figures, these actors with their faces painted black, and then terrifying him as a child, he wants to actually explore that in this play, in Othello. And because of when he was writing, he could explore it in a more free way, perhaps, than we would now. But it's almost like all the terrors and paranoia of white society are explored in Othello. But but Shakespeare himself doesn't seem to come down on any particular side. Because as you say, in some ways it reinforces, and as somebody else was saying, it reinforces stereotypes about Black men. In other ways, it shows the Black man as every man, as all of us. We're led astray. If somebody sets out to destroy us, who would survive? Who would survive if the Iago was constantly whispering that poison in your ear? So yes, I think it is a play about race. I think Shakespeare definitely wanted to write about race in this play in a way that he didn't in other plays.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Hello, ma'am. Can I just take one last question?
Yes, lovely.
So Shivadas is asking, like Bernard C. Jackson in his play Iago points out how Cynthia altered the real narrative of Othello's story, a story where Iago was in fact the victim of white supremacy. Do you think various adaptations and retellings of Shakespeare can be used as a way of questioning history?
Okay, that's interesting. A story. Yes, I do. I do think that, and that's why I think it's important to be aware of these plays so that you can challenge them as well. And that sounds like an interesting adaptation. So Iago is a victim of white supremacy. So in this play, is that Shiva? Shiva, isn't it? Who acts? So is Iago a Black man in this adaptation? So it's talking about Cynthia's original story.
Yeah.
Because I think in the original story, though, Iago was not. You mean Othello? Othello was the victim of white supremacy. The original story doesn't actually, interesting enough, the last question, from my reading of it, this Capitano Moro isn't that much about race. It does mention that he's a Moorish captain. That's what the title is. But that's it, really. It feels, and that's, I suppose, what's interesting about what Shakespeare seizes upon. It seems like he wants to explore ethnicity and race, so he makes this much larger in Othello than certainly my reading it was in Cynthia. There also wasn't this thing about a much older man marrying a much younger, and that's not in the original story either. So that seems to be like this kind of classic comic element, which Shakespeare chose to include for whatever reason. So that's interesting, though, if Bernard Jackson says that, because that's not something I would have noticed in Cynthia's story. And the servant is white in the story, I'm pretty sure. Yeah.